welcome everyone here to I think it's our fifth or sixth session. I should have counted. Do you recall? It is number five. Okay. Um, so just as a quick reminder, we've heard from Michelle Schulte, and then we heard from Eric Hemingway from Little Traverse Bay Bands, and then we heard from Brian Newland, and then we had this excellent session last month where we were talking about indigenous food sovereignty. And today we're going to talk about renewable energy. But before we jump in on that, I want to remind everybody that we are grateful that this session is being funded by in part by the Michigan Humanities Council, maybe in full, but at least in part by the Michigan Humanities Council, which is an affiliate of the National Endowment of the Humanities. So there's your, had to get that plug in. And so these are two friends, colleagues, and associates that I've been working with as part of the My Cares project, which I'm going to allow them to share with you what that is. But I'm just thrilled to be able that we're connecting some of these dots into some of our program work, like we did last month, where we talked about food. Here we are talking about energy, and it just feels like it's really connecting making these connections with tribal partners so much more real. So with that, I would like to introduce Marie Schaefer and Chelsea Schelly. And I think I'll just let you guys introduce yourselves because I did send your bios out.
Great, miigwech, Jim. And we're really honored and happy to be here today. And I am going to attempt, Jim, can I share my screen? Can you make it so that I can share my screen?
You should be able to. You are a co-host.
Yeah, try now. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I can.
Good.
Always this moment of technology. And then let me start this up. So are you all seeing our presentation? All right. So, and it's always this very awkward thing because I can't see a ton of you as I put the screen up. I'm at least be able to see Chelsea. But I'll jump in and do an intro, and then I'll hand it over to Chelsea. So bonjour, Marie Schaefer, Indigenous. I'm Marie. I'm Anishinaabe, Adawa, and Southern descent. I'm really happy and honored to be here today and have this discussion with you all. I grew up in Ann Arbor. I'm in Lansing right now. I just finished up a PhD in community sustainability at Michigan State. And a postdoc on this. Thank you, Casey. Yes, it finally finished up the PhD. I'm a postdoc on this My Cares project, which we'll talk about more, and that Groundworks is a partner in. But we're pretty excited today to talk to you about kind of how to apply Anishinaabe teachings and energy systems to energy systems. And I will also start out in a good way and do a really quick land acknowledgement for MSU, because that's where I'm at, which is the MSU occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe. And we worked really hard to hold them accountable to the partnerships and to the tribal sovereignty of the tribes in the Great Lakes. And that's a lot of what we do with My Cares as well. So that's my quick land acknowledgement, and I will hand it over to Chelsea.
Thank you, Marie, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm really glad to be here. My name is Chelsea Schelly. I'm an associate professor of sociology at Michigan Technological University. I'm joining you from the middle of Lake Superior here on Keweenaw, in the Keweenaw. I have been at Michigan Tech since 2013. Before that, I was partially in Madison, Wisconsin for my PhD. I am the descendant of settler colonizers, although I know very little about that origin for myself. Now I live here in the UP, and I live on a farm with my family and work at Michigan Tech. And my work is really inspired by the the belief, a really strongly held belief, that how we treat ecological systems and how we treat human beings and non-human beings are deeply linked and intertwined, and in our current contemporary context, our harmful treatment of ecological systems and harmful treatment of human and non-human beings are things that we can learn how to address by learning from our from societies and cultures and groups that have been more respectful in the ways that they engage with the earth and with one another since time immemorial. And I would like to acknowledge that Michigan Tech is located on Ojibwe homelands. The Anishinaabe Indian community is a thriving tribal nation just 30 miles south of Michigan Tech, and Michigan Tech occupies ceded territory established by the Treaty of 1842. And as the descendant of settler colonizers, it's important for me to honor that and to really be active and conscious of giving thanks in the beings that share this land with me, past, present, and future. Today, Marie and I are going to be talking about how we can apply Anishinaabe teachings to energy systems decision-making. But we're first going to start by giving a little bit of background to the collaborative research project that connects us to groundwork and to studying energy system transitions through the lens of Indigenous knowledge. So to start with, we're going to tell you a little bit about MyCares. What is MyCares, and how are we all connected, Groundwork, Michigan State, and Michigan Tech? MyCares is a National Science Foundation funded project. The title, the acronym, is for Michigan Community and Anishinaabe Renewable Energy Sovereignty. This is funded by the NSF Convergence Program, and the goal of the Convergence Program is to bring both academic and non-academic scholars, knowledge holders, researchers together to address contemporary problems that no one discipline can solve alone, and to actually recognize that the best work involves building new disciplines, building new knowledge systems that don't yet exist. And at the heart of the MyCares project is a conceptual framework based on our tribal nations partners' Anishinaabe teachings of the medicine wheel. And so this image here is meant to capture and to represent the medicine wheel, which is really intended to represent the complex relationships among different considerations for energy transitions, acknowledging that we can't consider any one element in isolation because they're all related, and representing the need for continual attentiveness to balance among the needs and priorities of both humans and non-human communities. So MyCares is grounded in these overarching research questions. We're starting in the East, asking what do we care about? We're moving south to ask what do we know? We're moving west to ask what is possible? And then finally, what should we do about it together? And this is the approach that the MyCares project is taking to study energy transitions. And this work is grounded in community engagement and community-based research with tribal nations and rural communities throughout the state of Michigan.
All right.
And we're, so can you switch slides there, Marie? Yeah,
oh.
Great.
Oh, yes. Okay. We're working out our transitions. But just to get everybody on the same page, because everybody's at different stages of understanding these concepts and what our Indigenous knowledge is. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what our Indigenous knowledge is, just to get everybody on the same page. And then I'm going to talk about what is settler colonialism, and then how it works, because these are things that our project deals with and works on every day. So just again, so we're on the same page, Indigenous knowledges are not just about the environment. You might have heard of TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge. That's a type, but it's not just about the knowledge, and it's not just data. You can't, there's been this extractive nature of research and other things where folks come in and take one piece of Indigenous knowledge and use that, but you really have to think of it in context. So you can't pick and choose what you want to use. And there's just, and the plural, why I'm saying Indigenous knowledge is there's just not just one. There's as many Indigenous knowledges as there are Indigenous communities in the world. So many. There's over 560 60 some odd federally recognized tribes in the US, and 12 federally recognized, not to mention state recognized tribes in Michigan. And I know some of other presenters have probably talked on some of these concepts before, but just again to get us all on the same page. And so indigenous knowledges are another type of knowledge system where knowledge is created, tested, and confirmed, just like Western science. And so some folks, some scholars, indigenous scholars call this, therefore, indigenous sciences. It's another way of thinking about it. And it comes from indigenous people and our view of the world and how it operates. And we're going to jump into these 4 R's in this presentation, but a lot of indigenous folks on Turtle Island or North America have these 4 concepts somewhere in there embedded into their knowledge system: the idea of rights, responsibility, relationality, and reciprocity. And we're definitely going to dig into those and actually have some participation from you all to think through like how to apply these to energy systems, these concepts. And it is something that is part of who we are and just who we are and what we do, and comes from having a relationship with the place for a very long time. And it's also really good to remember that the purpose of indigenous knowledge, while I do a lot of work in this bridging space between knowledge systems, at the end of the day, the purpose is to help indigenous people thrive and survive. Hopefully we can use these concepts in other ways, but I just always want to put that as a foundation as well, because this is what has made us thrive and survive for a very long time. So that's our base, just so everybody's on the page, same page. And then we're going to jump over to what is settler colonialism. And we can definitely talk through these towards the end, as well as people who aren't familiar get familiar. So the main purpose of settler colonialism really is for settlers to create their own homelands on indigenous lands. And it's still occurring today. It's not something in the past. And it really is a system of erasure. And by that, I mean, it's not only taking indigenous people from their own homelands, but it's removal of the history and any other traces of indigenous people on that land. So it's both of those things. So how does this all work? How does settler colonialism actually work in that system of erasure? So there's 2 main ways that Kyle Weitz talks about it from University of Michigan, and other folks talk about it. And the 2 ways that this actually works is through disappearances and dilemmas, or you get put between a rock and a hard place, is how I like to say it, where the disappearances is that erasure, where you're having direct actions that take indigenous people and make them invisible in their own homelands. And for plant relatives and our other relatives, it disrupts the relationship that is there, right, with those relatives. And there's also that disappearance that can happen. There's an example of the US public school curriculum that either we're not in there or it might be kind of discriminatory, the way that we're in there. I had a friend whose child was doing Michigan history, and Native Americans were listed as a natural resource along with copper in Michigan, or it was a very odd concept. And so her daughter, who is Native, came home and talked to her mom, and they had a conversation with the teacher. So there's still happening. It's still very strange, but that's that disappearances that happen. And then there's the dilemmas that between a rock and a hard place, where it's the opposite of the win-win, right? So it's a lose-lose, or I guess I'm going to take this because I have to type of situation. So it's really the choices that are imposed are really neither one are great. So for example, if you want to become if your tribe wants to become a federally recognized tribe in the United States, you have to have a form of governance that the US federal government recognizes. There's a lot of benefits to getting that form of governance, government, being recognized as a federally recognized tribe. But there's also some not so great things that happen along the way, where if your tribe didn't have a form of government like the U.S. government of having like a president or a council in that way and a Congress, if your form of government was like the Anishinaabe one, where we had different leaders during our 13 moon harvest cycle. So if you were harvesting manoomin or wild rice, you had different leaders in the community than you had for maple sugar or sugar bush time. So it didn't make much sense to have one leader the whole year round that was over everybody in that same way as the U.S. federal government, and so that creates a lot of conflict. But if you need to survive, you might want those benefits in order to become a tribe. So that's setting the stage, getting us all on the same page. And like I said, other presenters have probably talked about this, but we just wanted to make sure that everybody's on the same page for this. And then we'll jump into what we're going to talk about today and applying it to the 4 R's. And I will let Chelsea jump in there.
So yeah, Marie talked about erasure, right, as one of the key features of settler colonialism. And we hope that in some small way we're pushing back against that erasure today by highlighting the work of a Two-Spirit Anishinaabe scholar, Awasis, who wrote this article called Gwaba, Applying Anishinaabe Harvesting Protocols to Energy Governance. And I just pulled out a couple things from this article to sort of set the stage for our conversation. One is the language that they use, right? So they write in the article that they're choosing this animate verb to describe the process of harvesting energy, which literally translates to pick something out of water or fire with an instrument. For me, as somebody who's very new to thinking through Anishinaabe lenses and for thinking through the teachings from Anishinaabe and the teachings from the language of Anishinaabe-Moan, one of the things I find really valuable is that this is a language of animacy. This is not a language where things are docile or passive. The language itself is about bringing things to life and seeing things in their animacy and their active verbal engagement with the world. And language shapes the way we think about the world, right? We don't think about the world outside of the languages that we learn, and the languages that we learn shape how we think. And so to think about the world as animate, as active, for me is a really valuable shift to start us off in our conversation, just recognizing that shift in how we're thinking. The Awasis article has these very particular things that they highlight, thinking about colonial extractivism, the settler colonial model of extraction from the earth as the way to meet our needs and comforts, advocating for the use of these harvesting protocols, which are really linked to the ways of knowing from indigenous knowledges associated with rights, responsibility, relationality, and reciprocity, which we're going to talk through in some detail today. Really seeing those harvesting protocols as applying to energy systems, governance, and other ways of being in the world that can help to decolonize energy decision-making processes and other processes, and acknowledging the need for future research. So as I said, Awasis writes about rights, responsibility, relationality, and reciprocity, and that's the big picture concepts we're going to talk through this afternoon. And we're going to use a Jamboard in our conversation to try to jam together. So hopefully we can get that linked in the chat for you. Let's see if I can figure out how to do that.
I will try.
I think I just got it in the chat, and I think if you open it on your end, so the nice thing about Jamboard is we'll all be able to work in the same space, but also see slides and see one another, because you can move it around your screen as you'd like to. So in this Jamboard, for folks who are not familiar, this is just an interactive kind of space where we can learn and share ideas. On this very first slide or frame, we'd like to just practice using the Jamboard by having you add a note with your name. So if you go over to the kind of panel on the left-hand side of your screen, the thing that looks like a square sticky note that might be about to be pulled off is a sticky note. If you click on that, it will open one and you can add your name to it. They all go into that upper left-hand corner, but then you can move them from there. So when you have your sticky note, you can just cancel, and then you can pull it to anywhere on the screen. You can, as Jim has shown us, flip it upside down if you choose. You can make it smaller or bigger. You can do whatever you'd like to. You can change colors. This is just our practice with jamming and an opportunity for us to see the names of the folks who are joining us today. As we're talking through some of these big picture ideas, the teachings associated with Anishinaabe ways of knowing in these categories of these 4 R's and some examples that we've pulled together, we're going to ask you to use the Jamboard to share your ideas and your questions. So if you move to the second frame, you'll see a question on the teaching regarding rights. What questions do you have and what examples can you think of? And your examples do not need to be limited by energy, but could certainly be directly related to energy. We just want to use this as a space to get ideas flowing and to make sure that we have a record of your questions so we don't lose them and can address them. So there's one frame for each of the 4 R's that we'll use as we're walking through the rest of our conversation.
And there's no, I think most of you are anonymous within the system. So if you're nervous about putting your name to something, no worries. Just go ahead and I think you'll just, unless you want to put your name on something. Let me see if I can get back into our Google slideshow. Ooh, there we go. So I just wanted to introduce these concepts again, and we're going to go through each one of these 4 R's. But to start us out, I just wanted to say that while we're talking about these individually, they a lot of times overlap and intersect. And so it's rights don't have many things to do with relationality and responsibility. Reciprocity has to do with everything. So while we're talking about these individually, I just wanted to take a quick second and say that to think of them in a holistic way as well. And so yeah, that was just my quick, just understanding that this is a whole concept that we're trying to tease out these different ideas. And so we'll jump into rights.
Yeah, so we're going to start with thinking about rights. And the first, the left-hand side of this slide shows you the definition as pulled out from the Oasis article. So this is how Oasis is defining this, right? Is that Indigenous peoples have the inherent right to land-based practices and ways of living. There's also an implicit understanding that all elements of the natural world have inherent rights and self-determination equal to that of humans, right? So recognizing the right to existence for humans, but also non-humans and also non-animal beings, right? That the right to exist is something that applies to water and rivers. It is something that applies to ecosystems and mountains. It is something that applies to grasses and trees, as well as our non-human animal relatives. And just acknowledging that the indigenous knowledges from an Anishinaabe perspective start with a grounding in those inherent rights that belong to all things, not just humans. One of the teachings that I appreciate personally associated with rights, a teaching that comes from Anishinaabe principles, is that consent is required even when expressed in nonverbal ways. So in our kind of Western ontologies, we tend to think of consent as something that happens verbally, that you either give it or you don't give it by saying no. And we talk about consent as something that involves a verbal process. But in an Anishinaabe teaching, consent is something that you're looking for and can be expressed in nonverbal ways, that it doesn't always require a verbal expression, and that it's our job to seek consent and to recognize consent and to try to find consent, even if we're looking for nonverbal cues of that. The example that came to mind for me when I was thinking about, well, what does this mean in the context of energy systems or in the context of decision-making more broadly, is that in the current US policy regime, we can protect species only when they're identified as threatened or endangered, and then those species become valuable as a collective of species. But an Anishinaabe harvesting guideline would emphasize the rights of individual beings and non-animal elements, right? So we don't necessarily have a policy regime that acknowledges rights in the way that an Anishinaabe teaching would acknowledge rights. For me, that was an example that came to mind. So we're just going to pause for a second and allow you to kind of let this sink in, think about what questions do you have about rights, and are there examples that come to mind for you? And we can use that Jamboard to share some stickies there and populate some ideas that we'll return to in our discussion. Maybe we'll just take 2 minutes to jam if you would be willing to entertain us. Thanks.
Chelsea, do you want me to show the Jamboard? I think I can switch back. Or just let people see this?
I think everybody should have it open on their own end. So I'm not sure, you won't be able to see it unless you shift screens, I suppose. But other people might be able to. Oh, and maybe let's see.
And this can, like Chelsea was saying, apply to both kind of broadly to energy systems, but also your own work, thinking through if you don't necessarily think about energy and energy systems, but other things that are applied to maybe food systems and food sovereignty, or which is part of energy, but might not always be conceptualized that way.
Yeah. So I can see we have some questions and we can certainly return to them later. I guess I wonder, Marie, if you have any immediate reactions to the questions. What does nonverbal consent look like, right? Can you think of an example of what it would look like to see nonverbal consent?
The one that pops to my head immediately is when harvesting plants, putting tobacco down and asking permission, right? Like that is a form of, I mean, you're listening to those plant relatives, but then also being how do I say this? Being grounded and aware of what is going on in such a way that you have like a situational awareness of an environment or of a situation, so that if rice isn't taking hold for, I keep on coming back to rice because that's been in my head and in my space for so long. If it's, for example, if we're trying to restore a Manuman habitat and it's just not taking hold there, listening to that, that's a nonverbal cue. Like there's something else that's not going on, that that we're trying to listen to what the rice is saying, and it's saying we don't belong in this spot, maybe that that you're trying to put us in, or that the conditions there aren't right for us yet. So it's trying to listen in a non-auditory way. So those are the kind of the things that I think of immediately.
Yeah, and it shows right away kind of how connected these ideas are, right? Because recognizing inherent rights also means acknowledging acts of reciprocity, also means acknowledging those relationships. So yeah, understanding, being connected, and recognizing that other non-human beings have wills in some ways, right? They have their own will to something, whether that's a will to thrive, a will to grow, but recognizing that and paying attention to it, I think, is a great example. And I think, Marie, the examples you give associated with rice, to me, translate directly to thinking about agrivoltaics or mixed land use, right? If you're trying to combine solar with some kind of agricultural production, listening to the plants, watching the environment to see, do these species consent to being here, right? And being aware of that will, I think, certainly. So we'll come back to other questions as we continue the discussion. I think we can move on to thinking about relationality. And so the definition of relationality from Oasis is the idea of ecological connectedness that is culturally acknowledged, that relationality informs the treatment of the land and each other, and that humans can learn a great deal about good relations from non-humans who naturally understand the interconnectivity of life. And so acknowledging relationships, acknowledging the ways that we're connected. And one of my favorite teachings that I have learned from an Anishinaabe perspective or way of knowing, we tend to, I think, kind of simplify the idea of relationships with animals to think, okay, these non-human animal beings are our brothers and our sisters and we're connected and like our fates are intertwined, so we're related in that way. But from Anishinaabe indigenous knowledge, the animals are not only our relatives, they're our older and more mature relatives. And this is thinking on an evolutionary time scale. The animals that have been here the longest are actually the wisest. Those are the ones we should be looking to for advice because they're the mature beings and we're actually the really young and immature beings. So for me, that's a really wonderful teaching that shifts the lens of wisdom to say, these aren't just our brothers and our sisters, they're actually our older brothers and sisters. They're here to teach us and we're the ones who are immature. We're the ones who are here to learn. And there's some teachings about the beaver that I think are really relevant to me in thinking about this. There's a wonderful story about the woman who married a beaver, which is really a great tale about relationships between humans and non-human beings. And really what she learns is that humans have to be kind to beavers or beavers will not consent to being used, right? So they used for their purposes that they provided to humans, they only did willingly, right? And so the woman who marries the beaver learns that humans need to be kind to beavers because that's the only way that they will give themselves for human use. There's also a really wonderful lecture about the brilliance of the beaver. I'm going to pull a little bit directly from it. The lecturer talks about beavers as the wise animal. They are the holders of wisdom, and that we can look to the beaver to think about what it means to be wise. And so in this lecture, in this story, they talk about beavers building dams, which create deep pools and channels that don't freeze, which creates winter worlds for fish relatives. Those deep pools also drought-proof a landscape, making sure that larger animal relatives have places to drink and places to be. Dams open spaces in the canopy so that sunlight can increase. So these things that humans might consider a nuisance are actually providing reciprocal relational benefits to an environment. Beavers are also the first to return after a fire to start the regeneration make work, as this lecturer calls this, recognizing that beavers are building worlds and bringing water and can bring forth more life to an area. And so they're there to teach us lessons that we can learn from watching. Again, seeing the beaver not only as our brother and sister, but our older brothers and sisters that we can learn from. And so if we were to think about the beaver, and the lessons from a beaver and the wisdom there, we can say, well, what would it mean for humans to build worlds that benefit our human and non-human relatives, right? To recognize that the beaver's activity is not just for its own benefit, but mutually beneficial for its relatives around it. What would it mean for us to think about activities that we engage in that way? So again, we're going to turn back to the Jamboard. We'll focus on slide or frame 3, asking about relationality. If you wouldn't mind just taking a couple minutes to reflect and to see what are some of the lessons there for you in terms of energy systems and what questions do you have?
And this one, just like all of the rest, are connected to all the rest as well. So it's the relationality, you have reciprocity, reciprocal relations. So if you're having a hard time teasing that out, just go with it. It's okay. If you're worried about putting the right one on the right slide. So. And this is one of, I love them all, but I love relationality because that's the basis of so many things.
So maybe in the interest of time, we can move forward. I think some of these ideas are directly related to the rest of our conversation. And I really, now I would like to go find a story about chicken wisdom based on one of these questions, because I'm sure there is one.
I can't see the Jamboard, so I'm really curious about that one. That
You're excited
sounds
to get
amazing.
into it, huh?
Yeah. So we'll jump into the next one, just in the wanting to be aware of time and everything. So we're going to talk about next responsibility, which is another, one that bleeds into or goes into all of the rest. And so the definition from the article, really in Anishinaabe knowledge, Anishinaabe context. So talking about harvesting, that really Anishinaabe people affirm their land-based identity and fulfill our responsibility to sustain, that's knowledge basically, and the good life. And the teaching that we connect to this is that we just talked about non-human beings are not only relatives, and then they are, do we have a double teaching? Maybe there also we're the young ones and immature ones, just as a reminder. I guess we had a double teaching for both of these ones, so sorry about that, but the example is different. But you can see that overlap, that the teaching can be applied to both concepts, and it's that responsibility and our role to those non-human beings, to those elders. And the example that I really enjoy is the 7 generations principle that some of you might know. And that's both 7, there's 2 ways I've heard, 2 teachings I've heard of for the 7th generation, is both 7 generations forward. But the one that I've been really thinking on lately is the other teaching, the other way of thinking about it is 3 generations back, your current generation, and then 3 generations forward. And so you have that wisdom from your ancestors, you are thinking about what you're currently doing, and then how are you moving forward for the next generations. So that brings in that wisdom, that brings in that relationship and that responsibility to your ancestors, which is something that I definitely feel, and wisdom. So it's responsibility, but then also the wisdom that they've given you. And it really is a core of this idea of responsibility, and the 7 generations principle is that your responsibilities extend beyond you. So if you're thinking about an energy system built on the 7 generations principle, what would it look like? What is energy system that isn't just concentrating on maybe the needs of today and one generation, but learning from past mistakes and past successes for sure, but then also thinking about 3 or 7 generations forward. What are we going to need to sustain us and to thrive? So not just a stasis, but also to thrive and for our next generations. So we'll take a minute to jam with it, and we're definitely gonna get to questions on this at the end. But thinking about responsibility, and how do we build responsibility into an energy system that is usually very based on you're just supposed to be responsible for your individual self or family, but not necessarily your community, or the broader area. And I'll let Chelsea tell me when we've had a minute, because I can't see that board.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have one more slide and we'll have a discussion. One more R. I believe. Counted enough. I've counted my R's.
Yeah, great. So thank you all for adding some questions. We have some great ones to talk through. I'm excited to get there. So yeah, if you want to move on to the next frame, we'll talk through reciprocity.
So reciprocity underlines so many things. So it really is this mutual exchange where you're giving a gift, but along the way you're building that responsibility, and that first of all, that your role is to give that gift, that your responsibility is to give that gift. There's a protocol many times in gift giving. But when you give gifts, we were joking earlier about gift giving and food, and I many times gently bribe people to do things with food. But there's an obligation there. So if somebody accepts that gift, it's either taking on that obligation, but it's also you're building a relationship along the way. It's a reciprocal relationship where somebody else can come back and ask me to do something, or just build a relationship as well. I've been blessed to be able to work with Robin Wall Kimmerer, and I love her Braiding Sweetgrass book. And I really love the way that she thinks about and writes about reciprocity and having reciprocal relationship. So I'm going to read this quote, this teaching from her, that each person, human or no, is bound to every other in a reciprocal relationship. So just as all beings have a duty to me, I have a duty to them. If an animal gives its life to feed me, I am in turn bound to support its life. If I receive a stream's gift of pure water, then I am responding for returning a gift in kind. An integral part of humans' education is to know those duties and how to perform them. So that's part of what Anishinaabe conceptualization of what it means to be a human is to be in reciprocal relationships with our other beings. Example of how to apply this concept is Robin Wall Kimmerer's idea of service berry or gift. The actual word berry means, can be considered gift. And what it teaches us about the potential for the gift economy. And really in a gift economy, your wealth isn't understood in having just hoarding or just keeping how much you have it's really understood with how much you can share or how much you can give away. And so the practice for dealing with abundance is to give it away. So how could smart or demand response technologies be designed as reciprocal exchange systems? So if we're thinking about this reciprocal way of thinking about energy, how would that apply to energy systems? So if Jim gives me maple syrup, I have to do presentation, but then I can also, there's a relationship there now.
That's right.
Yeah, so again, you all are welcome to use the Jamboard as a space to share some of your ideas, what questions you have or examples you can think of on reciprocity. You know, the Oasis article does talk through some of the ways in which the gifts from the earth that we use to provide energy to humans, the ways that those things that we might typically think of as inanimate or, not engaged in their own will, that they really do have an active being in the world, right? She talks about wind, the gift that the wind offers to the earth is creating crevices so that animals are sheltered from the wind, right? That's a part of its reciprocity, and it's what it does on the earth is to create spaces to shelter from it. The gift of the sun is something that is provided, and every other creature on the planet has learned how to live within the limits of the sun's gift as a part of that relationship. And so it's one of the places where we can see I see some of the questions associated with those ideas. How do these kind of inanimate things give consent or engage in relationships? And I think there are great examples in that article. This question about demand response comes from me thinking about energy systems and the ways that we tend to approach them as managing our access to a finite or limited resource. And certainly the ways that we produce energy right now involve finite and limited gifts that we call resources. But if we think about a smart or a demand response system designed on principles of a gift economy and principles of abundance, I think it would really change the way even that the technologies are designed and how people engage with them, right? And how we think about what it means to engage with them. Right now, I think they're in many ways associated with ideas of limits, of limitations, of reductions, rather than on ideas of sharing. But technically, they offer the potential for a system designed based on sharing and giving and reciprocity. So that was just one example, but I welcome yours as well. Yeah, so Marie, I think we have just one more big picture question on our last slide that really is just what does it mean to apply these teachings to energy decision making? And if you, Marie, would like to close the Google slides and stop sharing so that you can also access the Jamboard, we can start there by looking at some of the questions that have been posed and attempting to provide some insight on them. But we also welcome you to raise your Zoom hand or just unmute yourself and speak up or put questions in the chat, however you feel comfortable engaging. This is our chance to provide you with some of the teachings from this article and some of the ways that we think it connects with energy systems, but we'd also like to hear from you. What do you feel like, how can we apply these ideas, these teachings to our decision making when it comes to energy systems? And if there are any particular questions on any particular frames you want us to not miss, please feel free to point us that direction.
Hi all, this is Michelle. I don't really have a question, but just a comment. And first of all, Miigwech, thank you for this. But I think that some of the things, a lot of times when we think about Anishinaabe teachings in different contexts and in different roles and avenues, like when we're talking about energy systems, we forget about the land access and the importance and the effects of some of these alternative energies on the land itself and how it impacts not only the land itself, but the ability for people themselves to access it. What plants grew there? What had to be cut down? What can't grow there quite the same? What other kinds of plants and animals are being called to that area that might be interrupted because of what we're doing? And so to really think forward, not just in trying to expand the work that we're doing, but think forward on where we're expanding it and who else lives there besides the people is really just important. And an important mindset to have when you're thinking about planning for the future. So,
yeah. Michelle, thank you, Miigwech. Because what I was thinking was that that example that I gave of like kind of being able to listen and that nonverbal consent back, right? So if you are able to, if you've been in a space for a very long time, or your family has, right? We can understand that land and we can understand what's going on there, and then start to have be able to listen, and then have those conversations, so that we do it in a good way. But yeah, that's excellent points.
I think from my perspective, it really gives us the potential at least to shift the conversation. Right now, a lot of conversations about renewable sightings are, kind of linked to this language of NIMBY, or that people are uncomfortable with the visual appeal. And instead, we could be asking questions about land access, land use, what other non-human and human relationships are being built on that land, right? That there are lots of people in lots of communities who don't want trees cut down to put up solar. And it doesn't mean that they're ignorant. It means that they might be holding on to a relationship with the land that we could honor, and we could ask questions about what shared values do we have about valuing the land and the relationships that exist within it, separate from humans, and that exist with humans through it. That for me is a really key, like it could be a mobilizer to bring us together to say we actually have more in common when it comes to our priorities when we think about it in those ways. I also think for me, one of the key principles here is this idea of abundance and recognizing that we don't need to always have more and more and more, right? So before we're thinking about where should we be developing, we should be thinking about where can we recognize we already have enough, or where can we redefine what enough even looks like so that we can make sure that we're not going beyond what the human species needs to sustain its place in its relationships to the world.
I'll just add one more thing too. I think that's great points. And Marie, when you brought up about the nonverbal, we think about wind energy, and I know lots of people, and myself too, who really value these alternative forms of energy and would love to see them because I see less harm. However, when we think about the nonverbal and listening to a space, the wind energy is great, but it does change the sound, and it does change the voice of the creatures who are already there, the sound of the wind, the language that the trees speak when the wind goes through them. And it does change some things, and that needs to be considered. And Chelsea made a great point. What is the relationship that people already have there, and look beyond just their arguments of this isn't going to be good because of this and it'll cause that. And but there's a relational thing that maybe not everybody is conscientious of, and we need to be considerate of that as well, and think beyond just what people are saying and what are they really feeling.
I think we're able to have those conversations when we build relationships with each other, right? And be able to create spaces like this one that we can learn and share from each other. Because I think there's so many contentious spaces out there. But when you build relationships with each other, with human and non-human beings, but in this context, with humans, you're able to say, hey, wait a minute, this is what I value. Let's have a conversation about that, and what is going on with that. Why do we need to do that instead of this? We can have those conversations, and hopefully train our decision makers to be able to have those conversations as well. But that goes back to that, building relationships and strong relationships that you can have good conversations and come at things in a different way than maybe other people have thought about. Other questions? And I'm going to try and look at the Jamboard too to make sure that we're getting those as well.
Yeah, some of the questions about reciprocity, I don't know if I could answer from an Anishinaabe knowledge system associated with kind of the value of gifts and how to interpret that and how to navigate that. I guess the thing that comes to mind for me most immediately in the context of energy is that sometimes the value that a community can get from an energy system isn't a monetary value, right? And that's why there's now an emerging conversation about community benefits and thinking about the reciprocal exchange that can exist between a developer, a utility, and a community if it's built on reciprocity, and that reciprocity doesn't always look like a dollar for a dollar. It doesn't always look like, an equivalent value, but figuring out what does a community want to see? What kind of access do they want maintained? What kind of benefits do they prioritize? And that the value of a gift can come from how hard you worked to produce it or how much it means to you as an individual. I think we know as humans that sometimes the most valuable gifts aren't the ones that cost any money, but that really have a meaning behind them. And I think we can bring that lesson into energy decision making too. If we think that the only value we can provide is a monetary value, we're missing out on a huge part of the human experience. And so to recognize that the value in a reciprocal exchange doesn't always look like a one-for-one, but figuring out what do people care about and how can we make sure that those values are built in, I think matters a lot.
I kind of think differently from individual to community scales too. Yeah, I think about some of the things that I've been gifted, and one of the things that is most valuable that has no monetary, associated with it, is a ear of corn, actually, from Hopi, that I got from a matriarch out there for when I was working out with the Hopi tribe. And it just reminds me of the conversations and the stories and the teachings that I had out there. But it has, no monetary value to it, right? So some of those things, but then also experiences.
I'll just share quick. We talked earlier about maple syrup as one of my preferred gifts. And one of the reasons I think is because it feels like it's a gift from a maple tree. And it does take an awful lot of time and effort, but when you're done, you really feel like you've valued something. And I definitely appreciate the trees when I'm tapping them, that's for sure. So I like the feeling of that as a gift.
Yeah.
And Melanie had a thing in the chat. I'm trying to keep track of.
Yeah, there's a lot of places to look.
Oh yeah, I love Manuman. So that's, if I got a big bucket of that would, because also if you've ever harvested, that's a lot of work, just like the maple syrup, and that people have put that time and effort, and then understanding that how to harvest, and that building that relationship back up as well.
I think one piece that I connect here, the reciprocity it's building a relationship that lasts over time, right? It's saying we're going to engage over a period of time. It's not I give you a gift right now and you give me a gift right now and we're done, right? And that idea of reciprocity, I think, can help us think about the kind of complex world of rights of non-human or inanimate things, right? That their rights aren't just like right this second, right? But their rights to continue existing over that 7 generations as well, or the rights of others that rely on them, are other non-human and non-animal relatives. And so it's complicated to think about the rights of the wind or the rights of the sun. But if we embed that in what kind of relationships, what kind of reciprocal engagement do they have with the world around them over a long period of time, these ideas are all connected. And for me, that reciprocity is really tied to an understanding of building relationality over time, not seeing it as something that starts and ends with an exchange of a single thing.
Yeah. Which, not to, I think I may actually use that to say, because I'm looking at the clock, and of course some folks are going to have to jump, but what that truly makes me think is, what I'm so pleased about is that this is a relationship that you two have, we have this connection through the My Cares project. And this is just really the start of a broader connection into groundwork. It feels like you guys just gave us a gift, which I really appreciate. We'll try to reciprocate as soon as we can, but also just keep this going, because this kind of conversation for me is just so helpful for opening my mind as we think about energy systems. We need to be thinking differently, and I just really appreciate it.
Well, Miigwech, it's been a pleasure to talk with you all and learn from you all too, like your questions that have me thinking about things in different ways. And yeah, I'm happy to, if anybody wants to send me an email and keep the conversation going in whatever way makes sense.
Yeah, I think, Marie, I'm going to volunteer you if that's okay. I think Marie and I could go through this Jamboard and make sure that we're providing at least some semblance of a response, even if it's just short, and then we can reshare that with you, because I want to acknowledge you all have put these questions out there, and I don't want to just leave them out there. Marie and I think, and again, thanks for letting me volunteer you. We can commit to, we'll provide some answers to those, at least our own reflections, and then share that back with you as a way to continue the conversation. And you are always welcome to reach out to either of us. We can share our slides too, which have our email addresses on them. So I'm happy to continue to engage.
Maybe for one final follow-up as well, because we talk about this relationship, both Marie and Chelsea are helping Groundwork and MyCan organizing a session for the about Native American, Anishinaabe communities and renewable energy at the upcoming summit. So we will continue to have this conversation working together, and it's a Groundwork connection that you can all participate in. So it's great to see this connections happening quickly. I love it.
Awesome.